Billionaire Michael Anderson had 30 minutes to close a $500 million deal with Chinese investors, but his translator was stuck in traffic. Desperate and arrogant, he grabbed a young waitress serving wine and threw a contract in ancient Mandarin in front of her with contempt. Translate this. You probably don't even know where China is on a map, but at least pretend to read while I find a real solution. The dining room went silent. The waitress looked at the document for 5 seconds, then began speaking in perfect ancient Mandarin, the aristocratic Beijing dialect from the Ming Dynasty. She translated 10 dense pages in under 5 minutes. Then she repeated everything in Cantonese, then Japanese, then classical Arabic, explaining the contract's legal concepts originated in ancient Quranic law. The Chinese investors stood applauding. Mr. Wang, who'd refused to do business with anyone who didn't respect his ancestors' language, was honored to meet such a master translator. Michael's $500 million deal became $550 million, saved by the waitress he'd just humiliated. What he discovered next destroyed his arrogance forever. She had a PhD from MIT, spoke 16 languages, worked for the UN, but was serving tables to pay for her brother's medical bills. This is how one moment of cruelty taught a billionaire what real wealth means. What city are you watching this video from, and what time is it? By the way, if you're enjoying my videos, I'd be so happy if you could subscribe to my channel and like this video. The Imperial Garden Restaurant, Manhattan. Billionaire Michael Anderson had 30 minutes to close a $500 million deal with Chinese investors, but his translator was stuck in traffic on the FDR Drive. Desperate and arrogant, Michael looked around the dining room and saw a young waitress serving wine with precise movements. Out of pure contempt, he placed before her a contract in ancient Mandarin and ordered her with a dismissive tone to translate it, expecting her to stammer excuses. The waitress took the document, read it for 5 seconds in silence, and began to translate it perfectly in ancient Mandarin. Then she continued in Cantonese, then in Japanese, then in classical Arabic. The dining room fell into total silence. The Chinese investors stood up applauding. Michael felt his blood freeze. That girl he had just humiliated in front of everyone was something he never would have imagined, and what he discovered in the following days would destroy his arrogance and change his life forever. Michael Anderson was 38 years old with a net worth of $3.5 billion. He had built the largest real estate empire in America, starting from zero in a small apartment in the Bronx, where his father had worked as a construction worker. Now he owned skyscrapers in Manhattan, resorts in the Hamptons, villas in Miami. He was accustomed to getting everything he wanted with a snap of his fingers. That December night, at the Imperial Garden Restaurant, the most exclusive establishment in New York, hidden on a side street in the Upper East Side, Michael had organized the most important dinner of the year. The Chinese investors from Beijing capital wanted to invest $500 million in his new project, a luxury residential complex that would transform the Hudson Yards area. But there was an unforeseen technical problem. Mr. Wang, 65 years old, a magnate with connections reaching all the way to the Communist Party, spoke only ancient Mandarin, not English, not Spanish, not even modern Mandarin, only the aristocratic dialect of Beijing, with expressions dating back to the Ming era. He had this eccentricity. He refused to do business with anyone who didn't respect the language of his ancestors. Michael had hired Chen Li, the best specialized translator in America. $50,000 for the evening, but 20 minutes before dinner, Chen had called in a panic. Stuck in FDR Drive traffic, an accident had collapsed everything. He wouldn't make it. Michael had smashed his phone against the wall, feeling the $500 million evaporate. The investors were already seated at the main table. 6 men in identical gray suits, perfectly aligned, expressionless faces. Mr. Wang sat in the center, tall and thin as a specter, white hair combed back, black eyes cold as ice. He had made a greeting gesture to Michael with his head. Then he had waited in silence. He was waiting for the translator. Michael felt panic transform into rage. He had called every damn agency in New York, none available with that specialization. Ancient Mandarin was as rare as a black diamond. He didn't have time. The investors would return to Beijing at dawn. It was now or never. He looked around the dining room with growing frustration. Wealthy clients laughing, waiters serving expensive dishes, candles glowing on white tablecloths, everything perfect, everything useless if he didn't close that deal. Then his eyes fell on her, a young waitress, perhaps 27 years old. Black hair pulled back in an elegant bun, impeccable black and white uniform, pouring champagne at a corner table with measured movements. Something in her way of moving, in the absolute concentration on her face, triggered a desperate and arrogant idea in Michael's mind. He stood up abruptly, crossed the dining room with heavy steps, grabbed her wrist while she was filling a glass. The customer protested. The waitress startled, causing champagne to spill on the tablecloth. She turned toward Michael with dark eyes wide with surprise. Michael literally dragged her toward the investors' table, ignoring her low-voiced protests. The other waiters looked shocked. Some customers murmured indignantly, but Michael didn't care. He was desperate, and when he was desperate, he became even more arrogant. He pushed her toward a chair next to his seat, took the contract from his leather briefcase, and threw it in front of her forcefully. Then he said in a dismissive tone and voice, loud enough to turn half the room, he needed someone to translate that document from Mandarin. She probably didn't even know where China was on a map, but at least she should pretend to read something while he bought time to find a real solution. The waitress looked at him with an expression Michael couldn't decipher. It wasn't fear, it wasn't anger. It was something colder, more calculated. Then, without saying a word, she lowered her eyes to the document. For 10 seconds, there was absolute silence. The waitress was reading. The Chinese investors watched her with curiosity. Michael drummed his fingers on the table impatiently, already thinking about how to apologize to Wang and perhaps save at least part of the deal. Then the waitress began to speak. And what came out of her mouth froze Michael's blood. She spoke in perfect Mandarin. Not school Mandarin, not tourist Mandarin. Ancient Mandarin, Beijing dialect, with the aristocratic accent that Michael had heard only in historical recordings. Her pronunciation was so precise, so natural, that she seemed like a noblewoman from the Ming dynasty, reborn in the 21st century. She translated the complete contract. 10 dense pages of legal and financial terms in less than 5 minutes. Each clause, each technical term, each nuance. Then she stopped. She looked at Michael with those dark eyes that now shone with something that seemed like cold satisfaction. And she continued. She repeated the entire translation in perfect Cantonese, then in Japanese. Then, as if that weren't enough, she added a version in classical Arabic, explaining that some legal concepts in the contract had origins in ancient Quranic laws, and that it was interesting to note the similarities. The dining room had fallen into the most absolute silence. All the customers were watching. The waiters had stopped with trays in hand. The maitre d' had his mouth open, and the Chinese investors, those men of ice who never showed emotions, were standing, applauding. Mr. Wang stood up slowly, took 3 steps toward the waitress, and spoke in ancient Mandarin for the first time that night. His voice was full of respect, almost reverence. The waitress responded with a slight bow in the same language, with the same elegance. Then Wang turned toward Michael and said something in Mandarin. The waitress translated with a calm and professional voice, explaining that Mr. Wang was honored to be in the presence of someone who spoke the language of his ancestors with such mastery. He asked if the young woman could stay as translator for the evening. He added that in 40 years of international business, he had never met such a prepared translator. Michael looked at the waitress. She returned his gaze, and in those dark eyes, Michael saw something that made him feel small. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't revenge. Just a quiet awareness of her own value, and a silent question. Do you understand now how stupid you've been? Michael nodded stiffly, unable to speak. Suddenly feeling like the biggest idiot in New York, he had just behaved like an arrogant bastard with someone who was evidently 1,000 times more prepared than him. And everyone had seen it. The dinner lasted 5 hours. The waitress, who introduced herself to the investors as Emma Martinez, sat next to Michael and managed the entire evening with impeccable professionalism. She didn't just translate with absolute precision. She anticipated questions, suggested answers, explained cultural differences between Chinese and American mentality. When the investors talked about architecture, Emma discussed for 20 minutes, in Mandarin, about the Forbidden City, the gardens of Suzhou Tang Dynasty architecture. The investors nodded enthusiastically. She pointed out 3 clauses in the contract that could create problems according to Chinese law. She suggested modifications. Wang was so impressed that he increased the investment by $50 million. At the end of the night, the contract was signed. $550 million instead of $500 million. The biggest deal in Michael's career, saved by a waitress he had humiliated 2 hours earlier. When the investors left, Michael followed her to the service area. Emma was stacking plates when he caught up with her. She turned around, not surprised. Waiting. Michael asked directly who she really was. Emma explained calmly. Emma Martinez, 29 years old. Waitress for 4 months, but also a graduate in Oriental languages from Columbia University with honors, master's from the Sorbonne, PhD from MIT. She spoke 16 languages fluently, 8 at an advanced level. She had worked for the United Nations, for the European Union, for conferences on 5 continents. Michael asked incredulously why she was working as a waitress. Emma laughed bitterly. 2 years earlier, her brother had had a serious accident. Astronomical medical expenses. She had left the United Nations, spent all her savings, sold her apartment, taken out loans. Her brother now needed constant rehabilitation. $4,000 a month. She earned about $2,500 working as a waitress. She needed immediate money. Michael felt acute shame. Shame for how he had treated her. A woman with an MIT PhD was earning less than one of his interns. He made an immediate decision. $18,000 a month as a linguistic consultant, plus bonuses, plus insurance that covered rehabilitation, plus $60,000 as compensation for that night. Emma asked why he was doing it. Guilt? Pity? Michael admitted it was a bit of everything, but also something more. He had seen real talent, hidden excellence. And he had realized how blind he had been. How many extraordinary people he had ignored or trampled just because they weren't in the right place. He said he needed someone like her, someone who didn't flatter him, who wasn't afraid to tell the truth. And she deserved to be paid for her real value. Emma set a condition. Absolute respect. She wasn't an object, she was a professional. If he crossed that line again, she would leave. Michael looked at those firm eyes. For the first time, someone wasn't impressed by his billions. Someone looked at him and saw only a man who had to earn respect. He shook her hand, feeling something change inside him. Emma started the following Monday. Michael had given her the best office in the skyscraper, 30th floor with a view over Manhattan. Glass desk, cutting-edge technology, library full of dictionaries in 20 languages. Emma entered, looked at everything with an impassive expression, said it was more than enough. The first weeks were a revelation. Emma was a communication strategist. She read contracts and found ambiguities that lawyers had missed. She spoke with Chinese partners, perceiving cultural nuances that avoided costly misunderstandings. She analyzed Arab proposals, explaining differences between Islamic law and American law. In a month, she became indispensable. But something deeper was happening. Emma was changing not just Michael's work, but him as a person. When he proposed demolishing old buildings, she asked about the elderly tenants. When he wanted to hire low-cost workers, she explained that fair salaries created better results. At first, Michael was irritated. Then he began to listen. She saw people where he saw only numbers. One March night, they were working on a German proposal. It was past 11 p.m. Michael raised his eyes and looked at Emma, concentrated, hair loose, shoes removed. He understood something that terrified him. He was falling in love. It wasn't just attraction. It was the way she challenged him, the way she wasn't impressed by his money, the way she saw not the billionaire but the man, and often found that man lacking. He closed the laptop, saying it was time to go home. Are you enjoying this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now let's continue with the video. Emma smiled, asking why he cared now after 20 years. Michael said impulsively that he worked too much because he had nothing else. No family, few friends, just work and money. But lately he was wondering if it was worth it. Emma looked at him for a long time, then said softly, it was the first honest thing she had heard him say. There was hope for him after all. That night, Michael returned to his $6 million penthouse. He looked around the empty rooms full of expensive objects, but without soul. And he cried for the first time in 20 years. He cried for the person he had become. And because now, thanks to Emma, he saw it all with painful clarity. 3 months later, Michael's life had changed completely. He still worked hard, but now with more attention to human impact. He had started affordable housing programs, increased all employees' salaries, created a fund to help families in difficulty. Emma was at the center of everything, not because she explicitly asked for it, but because her mere presence made him see things differently. She was like a mirror that reflected all his choices, forcing him to ask himself, is this the person I want to be? But then the problem arrived. Michael could no longer hide his feelings. He thought about Emma constantly. He sought excuses to see her. He prolonged meetings just to be near, and he knew it was wrong. She was his employee. There was a power imbalance, Emma noticed. She began to create distance. Briefer meetings, more professional responses, fewer personal moments. Michael felt that distance widen. And it drove him crazy, but he understood why she was doing it. Then one day Emma entered his office with a serious expression. She sat without waiting for an invitation, and said directly that she had to talk about something important. She had received an offer from the European Commission. Senior position as head of the translations department. Excellent salary. Brussels. Starting in 2 months. Michael felt the floor crumble. He asked in a voice that tried to seem neutral if she had already accepted. Emma responded that not yet, but probably would. It was the opportunity she had waited years for, and above all, staying in New York was becoming complicated. Michael asked what she meant by complicated. Emma looked him straight in the eyes and said calmly that he knew exactly what it meant. The tension between them had been palpable for weeks, and it wasn't professional, it wasn't healthy. One of them had to leave, and clearly it would be her. Michael felt something break inside. He asked if she felt what he felt. Emma hesitated, then nodded slowly. Yes, she felt it. But precisely for that reason, she had to leave, because he was her boss, because there was a power imbalance, because people would talk, because she had spent her entire life building her professional reputation, and she wouldn't let a feeling destroy it. Michael said desperately that he could leave the company. She could stay, and he would find another job. Emma laughed bitterly. Leaving a $3.5 billion empire for a woman he'd known for 3 months was ridiculous, but Michael insisted. He said that in the last 3 months he had been happier than in the previous 30 years. That money meant nothing if he returned home to an empty penthouse. That she had made him see what kind of man he could be. And now he didn't want to go back to the person he was before. Emma looked at him with eyes full of unshed tears. She said softly, it was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever said to her. But it wasn't enough. She couldn't build a life with someone out of gratitude or need to be saved. It had to be true love, equal, without imbalances. And with him as her boss, she could never do that. Michael felt desperation transform into determination. He said he would give her time then. She could go to Brussels, work there as long as she wanted. And he would work on himself. He would become the type of man she deserved. And then, if she still wanted, they would try as equals. Emma shook her head. It was a fantasy. Real life didn't work that way. But Michael interrupted, gently taking her hands. He said 1 year. She in Brussels, he in New York. No contact, no pressure. Just time for both to grow. And after a year, if she still wanted to give him a chance, he would be there. Emma looked at their joined hands, then looked at his face, and saw something she had never seen before, complete vulnerability. The arrogant billionaire had disappeared. There was only a man who for the first time in his life was asking instead of taking. She nodded slowly. 1 year. Then they would see. Emma left for Brussels on a cold June morning. Michael didn't go to the airport, respecting his promise of distance. But he looked at the clock when he knew her plane was taking off. And he felt a physical pain in his chest. The year that followed was the most difficult and transformative of Michael's life. He had promised to work on himself, and he did it with the same determination with which he had built his empire. He started therapy. For the first time, he talked about his poor childhood, about the shame he had felt, about the rage he had transformed into ambition. He understood he had spent 20 years building walls around himself, using money as armor against the world. Emma had been the first person to see beyond those walls, and that had terrified and fascinated him. He changed the way he managed the company. No more unilateral decisions. He began to listen to his employees, to consider the human impact of each project. Some executives thought he had gone crazy. Others appreciated the change. Those who didn't adapt left. He started charitable works, not for publicity, but because Emma had taught him that those who have much owe much. He created scholarships for poor youth, financed rehabilitation programs for accident victims, built housing for families in difficulty. And during the entire year, he didn't contact Emma. Not a call, not a message, not an email. He respected his promise, but he thought about her every day. Emma in Brussels was living her own transformation. The work was excellent, the city fascinating, colleagues respectful. But something was missing. At first she didn't understand what. Then one night, while walking through the illuminated streets watching couples strolling hand in hand, she understood. He was missing. She had fallen in love with Michael, not the arrogant billionaire who had grabbed her in the restaurant, but the man she had seen emerge in their 3 months together. The man who listened, who doubted, who tried to be better. That man was worth waiting for. But she was afraid. A year was long. People changed. Promises were forgotten. Maybe Michael would find someone else. Maybe he would forget her. Maybe. Exactly 1 year after Emma's departure, Michael was in his office looking at Manhattan from the window. He had changed physically, lost weight, exercised, dressed less ostentatiously, but it was the internal changes that mattered. He had learned to listen. He had learned to feel. He had learned that real power doesn't come from control, but from connection. He looked at the clock. 2:16 p.m. Exactly 1 year ago, Emma had boarded that plane. His promise was fulfilled. They were free to contact each other, but Michael was paralyzed by fear. What if she had found someone else? What if she no longer wanted to know about him? What if the year had erased what they had? He was about to take the phone when he heard knocks on the door. He said to come in without turning, still lost in his thoughts. Then a familiar voice said his name softly. Michael turned abruptly. There in the doorway was Emma. Shorter hair, blue dress, elegant, uncertain smile. Real. True. There. Michael crossed the office in 3 steps and took her in his arms without thinking. Emma laughed against his chest, arms closing around his waist. They stayed like that for a long time. Just breathing each other, letting a year of distance melt. When they finally separated, Michael asked in a hoarse voice why she was there. Emma smiled, saying 1 year had ended. She had promised to give him a chance. She was there to keep the promise. Michael said she had a wonderful job in Brussels. Why risk it? Emma explained that in recent weeks she had researched about him, had called his employees, talked to charities he financed, read articles about his new approach to business, and she had seen that he had kept the promise. He had changed. Really changed. Then she added something that stopped Michael's heart. She also had a proposal. Columbia University had offered her a professorship. Teaching and research. New York. She could start next month. Independent. Equal. Hers. Michael looked at her. This extraordinary woman who had saved not just a $550 million deal, but his soul. He asked if she was sure. Emma responded she had never been more sure of anything. Michael knelt. Emma startled, surprised. He took her hand, saying maybe it was too soon. Maybe it was crazy, But he had waited a year and didn't want to wait anymore. He didn't have a ring, hadn't prepared a speech. He just had one certainty. He wanted to spend the rest of his life with her. He wanted to be the man she deserved. He wanted to build a life together. Equals. Emma looked at him from above, eyes full of happy tears. Then she said simply, "Yes." And Michael felt for the first time in his entire life that he was truly rich. 2 years later, Michael and Emma married in a small ceremony in the Catskills. The guests were an eclectic mix: company employees, university professors, families Emma had helped with free translations, youth who had benefited from Michael's scholarships. Emma's brother, completely recovered thanks to rehabilitation, was the best man. He made a moving speech about how his sister had saved him twice. Once with money earned as a waitress, and a second time proving that talent and humility always defeat arrogance and privilege. Emma became one of the most respected linguists in America. Her courses at Columbia were legendary, her books bestsellers, but above all, she was happy doing the work she loved, living with the man she had learned to love, and Michael. Michael had learned the most important lesson of his life. He had learned that true wealth isn't measured in billions. It's measured in moments, in Emma's smile when she solved a complex linguistic problem, in her laughter when he said something stupid, in the way she fell asleep against his chest every night. He had learned that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the most unexpected places. Sometimes they look like waitresses serving wine. Sometimes they speak 16 languages. Sometimes they save you, not by giving you what you want, but by showing you what you really need. And if you're humble enough to listen, brave enough to change, and wise enough to appreciate, those treasures can change your life forever. Give it a like if you believe a person's real value doesn't depend on their job. Comment if you also believe humility always defeats arrogance. Share this story to remember that never judge someone by their position. Subscribe for more stories that prove change is always possible. Sometimes it takes someone extraordinary to show us how ordinary we are. Michael had everything the world considers success: money, power, respect. But inside he was empty. Emma had nothing the world values. She worked as a waitress, had debts, was invisible. But inside she was full of talent, dignity, value. And when Michael finally opened his eyes to really see her, not the waitress, not the employee, but the extraordinary human being she was, his life changed. Because in the end, what makes us rich isn't what we have. It's who we become, and it's who we love.